Happy Hour, the podcast that explores new and exciting historical fiction novels. I'm your host, Jane Healy, and in today's episode, we welcome my friend, best-selling author Samantha Woodruff to discuss her latest novel, The Trade-Off. Welcome, Sam.
Hi, Jane. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I've been looking
Me
forward to this
too.
one.
Me too. I'm going to do a quick bio and a little about you, and then I'm going to jump in. But I was just thinking, I've been so lucky this month because I've had a lot of friends on, which is so fun. So
I've been listening a lot, and I'm like, oh, it's good. It's a good lineup lately. Like
yeah,
everybody I
exactly.
know.
A lot of the ladies.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
all right. So Samantha Green Woodruff has a BA in history from Wesleyan University and an MBA from NYU Stern School of Business. She spent 15 years at Viacom's Nickelodeon before leaving to parent her two young children. After studying at the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College, Woodruff completed her first novel, The Lobotomist's Wife, which was a #1 Amazon bestseller and Amazon First Reads pick. She has contributed an essay to the essay collection On Being Jewish, which releases November 8th. All proceeds from the book will go to Artists Against Anti-Semitism, a nonprofit founded in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks in Israel. Welcome, Sam, again. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So hold up your pretty book, The Trade-Off.
Here
And
it is. I love this
the
book.
cover.
I love the
Yes.
cover. Love the orange.
I love the orange. Love the book. Talk about the premise of this novel and what inspired you to write it, because I was reading your author's notes, of course, at the end of the book, and it was actually a more recent event in the news that led to you writing this story.
Yes. So we could spend the whole podcast with me talking about this. I'm going to try and be as short as I can. So the story of The Trade-Off is it's about a young Jewish woman named B. Abramowitz. She's a twin, and she and her brother are first generation US born immigrants in the 1920s. Her parents were Russian. They're not immigrants. They're first generation born US, and they're making their way, but they're poor Jews on the Lower East Side. And B happens to have this unbelievable aptitude for math and numbers. And she's kind of the worker of her family. She's the student. She's the one who's responsible. And some of that is also just of the time that there was a lot of caretaking that women did for men in that era, as you know. But she has this idea that she wants to work on Wall Street because she's really good at picking stocks, and she's learned how to do that from a young age. And so she tries to go to Wall Street to be a stockbroker, only to discover that in this era, while there was a lot happening that was liberated for women in the 1920s, it was this great moment, and suffrage had just happened, that she can't do anything because she's, first of all, female, and there were very, very few females to begin with. Second of all, poor, and third of all, Jewish. And so she's got 3 huge strikes against her. And she manages to get a job, a back office job, but she really wants to be a broker. And eventually she hatches a plan for her twin brother, Jake, who is a natural born salesman, super charming, and wants to work as little as possible, for him to be the broker and the face of the family. And she does all the stock picking. And together they make their family a fortune. But then the tides turn, and she sees the crash coming, and she wants to do something about it to try and save the family, but her brother doesn't believe her. And so there's this whole Chicken Little kind of, she keeps thinking the sky is falling, and nobody around her believes that it's going to happen. So she sees the crash. The inspiration for the story, very, very, if we trace it back to the contemporary event, it all started with this event on Wall Street that was called the GameStop short squeeze. And there was a movie made about it called Dumb Money. And the Seth Rogen character, if you've seen the movie, actually is one of my husband's best business, Wall Street friends.
Oh.
Yes. So there was a personal angle. So when this GameStop thing was happening, and basically for people who don't know what it was, it very simply, and if you don't understand long and short selling, if you sell long, you believe that the market's going to go, essentially you're betting that a stock or the market overall is going to go up, and that means you are a bull. And if you sell short, what you're essentially doing is assuming that a stock's price is going to fall, and you're taking an option to buy it at that lower price. So you make the difference, you buy it and you make the difference of the higher price and the lower price. But essentially you're betting that the stock is going to drop and that it's overpriced. And those are called bears. And in the GameStop short squeeze, the Seth Rogen character, this hedge fund guy, was short GameStop, which was a bricks and mortar video game retailer in a time, in 2021, like not a growing business.
No.
So it seemed like a natural short sale. However, it was also during the COVID. So people were still isolated and furloughed, and people didn't have their jobs, and there were all these people at home that were investing. And they kind of banded together on Reddit with this one guy as their ringleader, and they decided that they were going to bet against the hedge fund bad guys and make the stock go up. And for a second, for like a day they did, and it totally disrupted the market. None of that is the part that I thought was interesting, because I think the stock market fundamentally is kind of boring, even though that's what my husband does for a living, and I have an MBA, but it was never my thing. But what I was fascinated by was that this guy who was our friend, who was the short seller, was vilified by the Reddit people. To the point where like he was receiving death threats, and there were like evil memes about him every single day. And it really it became a personal attack. And I said to myself and then to my husband, I don't understand how he's just doing his job here in this particular instance. He's not an evil guy. And why is it that everyone automatically assumes that that morality follows wealth? So you're moral and good if you're poor, and you are evil and bad if you're rich. And I wish I could write about that somehow. And then my husband told me about this guy, Jesse Livermore, who shorted the crash of 29. And I said, oh, there were short sellers in 1929. And so then I basically built a story around that idea to explore the complex morality of wealth in a historical setting. And then Hernan Diaz came out with a Pulitzer Prize winning book, which totally stole my thunder.
But I love this story, and I love your take. And I remember when the whole GameStop thing happened, because the guy who was kind of the Pied Piper of it all was from Massachusetts, and I was like riveted. It was riveting. There was all these characters. It was, and I saw the movie. The movie I thought was decent too. But yeah, fascinating story, and it's so funny how writers come up with ideas out of things like that. This is historical fiction, but that you came up with it. I have a few research questions. Yeah. So I want to talk, first of all, you were just talking about the stock market. And so here's this bee, and she is a genius and mathematically gifted and has an almost instinctive understanding of the stock market. And I think I remember us commiserating about research, and like you did an extraordinary amount of research for this book. And part of what you had to do was was kind of learn all of this so that and write about it in an interesting way and also an understandable way. And like talk about that. Like, what was your research and how did you do it? Because it's hard.
It's a great question, because it was one of the hardest parts for me.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, as I say, my husband is a finance guy. So he actually did some of the legwork for me on this book. He read all the big economic treatises about the crash. And some of them actually ended up being more social history than true finance economic history, but about the era. And then he was like, read this one. That one's going to be too boring to you and you won't understand it. So he did that work for me. And then as I got to understand all the forces of the time, because it was such a different time than the way we understand finance and the financial markets today. Like, even if you understand nothing, it is a lawful to a degree world. And back in the 20s, it was not, right? I mean, you could do anything. And the guys, there was a small group of guys who were the big bankers and the richest people in America who would collude to drive up or down stock prices for their own good. So even if you were someone like B who could see patterns and predict them and make sense of them, you wouldn't necessarily win, because sometimes things would happen that were totally beyond, anything one could predict. But so I first started there to just understand the market forces a little bit. And then I had to start putting myself in situations like, what would she see that would make her think this? And
Mhm.
I mean, I have to be honest, Chat GPT was super helpful because I would say, like, what stocks were unusually high in this time? And then they would like give me a list and then I'd go check it 5 other places to make sure it was actually a true list.
Mhm.
I also got the Dow data on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis and an annual basis from 1924 through 1930. And it had all these Excel charts. I used to do market research, so I like to kind of play with data in Excel. So I would do that too, and I would look at like when I was first writing the story, I would try and map everything that happened to where the Dow was. So if there's a moment where there's a big dip and people are losing money, it's because that actually happened in the market. That was like one of my, we all have rules in historical fiction for what has to be factual. That was one of the things I made factual. And then Bee's understanding and how she could take her observations and turn them into predictions. Um, I talked it through with my husband. I would say, would this make sense if she saw this and then she thought that? And he was like, yeah. And then he read the draft and said, this is so rudimentary. You have to put more stock specific stuff in it.
Oh.
And I said to him, that's not my audience. Like, I want to write it so that if I read it, I wouldn't feel like it was a boring stock book. I want you to feel the momentum of the stocks and the aha moments, but I didn't want the reader to be bogged down. And I have gotten a few critical reviews that way of like, I know a lot about finance and this is not really a finance book. And I'm like, yes, it is not a finance book. Correct.
Right.
But I spent a lot of time there. And then I got to do the stuff I really like, which is the social history and flappers and speakeasies and early Lower East Side Jewish life and all those other pieces. So that, I did that too in my research process. But the hardest part was definitely turning those stock concepts into something that could feel narrative and not make someone put the book down.
Yeah,
So
and I think you did a really beautiful job with that because and also that kind of historical detail lends an authenticity, that you would that maybe that's kind of what your husband meant. Like you just needed to dig deeper so that people would believe that she was who, she was this character, right?
right.
So yeah, yeah, totally agree. Um, Talk about how B and her family story was inspired by your own family history. I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? And it's, I don't know if you have this in the writing process where sometimes you forget the origin of things and then you go back and like at this point when you're reflecting and doing book tours and talking to people, you kind of remember how all the pieces came together. And some of it I put in my author's note, but so B's family history, basically I knew I wanted to write about someone who wanted to short sell the crash. And fundamentally, because the crash was such a disastrous moment for the country and the world, this had to be someone who was very likable and empathetic and had to have a good reason for wanting to be in the market and wanting to make money.
Mhm.
And so I started to think about like what could be motivations besides greed that would have somebody wanting to be a broker and trying to make as much money as possible. And for B, part of it is because it's a skill she has and she loves exercising her mind. It's like doing a puzzle.
Mhm.
But the other piece of it is I flashed to my grandmother, whose name is Pauline, and Pauline is B's mother in the book, but it was my grandmother Pauline's mother, whose name I don't know. So my great grandmother had the story that I gave to B's mom. So she emigrated from Poland or Russia, like, the borders were very porous, um, to flee early pogroms and had been aristocratically wealthy and lost everything. And so the family lore was that she had several boy children and a girl, and the girl was my grandma Pauline. And Grandma Pauline was treated like her servant because her mom refused to adjust to Lower East Side life and do all the things that other women on the Lower East Side were doing. So Pauline had to do everything. And so I thought that was just such a great seed of developing a lot of relationships about wealth and money, and a great way to explore the fact that sometimes you really want to be really rich and it doesn't make you a bad person. It's not for bad reasons. It's because of family trauma. Like both B and Jake in their own ways want to make money, but it's because of this family trauma. And it's always better when the family trauma is real.
Mhm.
And then there's one other piece of my family history that I stuck in there. One of my great aunts passed away while I was writing this book, and I went to her funeral down in Baltimore, and I kind of got dragged by my mom kicking and screaming. And then I saw this family, and one of her kids was talking about her, and they talked about how she always referred to them as the house of whatever. And I was like, that is so great. Maybe I should call this book The House of Abramowitz. And then so I worked that in, that whenever Pauline is referencing like her grandeur, she talks about the house of, So anyway,
I like that.
that's all family history.
So you mentioned some of the sources in your research notes in the back of the book. What was there anything about in your research that surprised you, and like anything that you were like, oh, I didn't see that coming, or that helped you like shape the narrative of the story in a different way?
Yeah, so I actually wrote a piece about this. Now I think for Writer's Digest, I can't remember where. I have to look through all the stuff I did, how glad you like do all that stuff. I developed this incredible relationship with a man named George Robb, who was a professor. He's retired at William Paterson University in New Jersey. And he wrote a book called Ladies of the Ticker. And he had a very interesting take, because it was a lot of like, he looked at plays and movies and early movies and, early literature. And he kind of compiled, and then also just history, profiles of women kind of from the late 1800s through to the 1930s or 40s, women who worked in finance in some way. His book was one of 3 that I was able to find. Like, there was no research, no material available about women on Wall Street in those early years. And in fact, a book just came out about women on Wall Street, but even that one focuses more post World War II and forward. But that book makes the point that I am about to make to you, which is that there's a dearth of resources, and part of the reason is because there was a dearth of women.
Mm-hmm.
So when I learned that, and yes, I should have known it, because even today finance is very male.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow, when you think of the 1920s, you're thinking of this like flappers and liberated women. So you think that in the world of Wall Street, where there's all this wealth, that there would be the same. But one of the most fascinating things I learned, which I also alluded to before, is that the only use they had for women in that era on Wall Street was if they had connections to other women with money who they could then get to invest with the bank. So if you were not a woman who had connections, meaning you didn't go to a Seven Sisters school and you didn't belong to a social club and you weren't like a daughter of the Mayflower, there was no use for you in the banking world, really.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me was so fascinating and surprising, that because you would think that those kinds of socialite women wouldn't be working. So it's this weird, these women were working, but they were working because they had been volunteering for the Red Cross and at their husband's side at the front, and all selling war bonds and doing things that distinguish them in their social echelon. And
Mm-hmm.
then the banks sort of started to say, oh, you could help us.
Mm.
So as soon as I learned that, and then I learned that if you were not one of those kinds of women, so if you were poor, the best you could hope for was to be a secretary, and that was a stretch. And then if you were Jewish, that was the other crazy thing. Some of the big investment banks are Jewish, and
Mm-hmm.
they didn't hire Jewish women. So there was no place if you were a Jewish woman to work on Wall Street. And so I took all those things, and that really became Bee's journey, because to me, it was like, I was so stunned by it. I wanted the reader to experience it, and I kind of wanted to experience it. So
Yeah.
it was big. And George Robb, who I brought up at the beginning, he became the sounding board for me. Like, I reached out to him, which I've never done before. I did a lot more of reaching out to people for this book's research than The Lobotomist's Wife. Partially because I had no idea what I was doing then, and I didn't know you could do that and people might answer you. So I did try. This time I did. But he and I had several conversations, and then I'd get stuck and I'd be like, well, do you think she could do this? And he'd say, well, that would be really unusual. Maybe she would do this. And, kind of all those, even that there was just a women's lunchroom. Like there were things like that, that if it weren't for him, I don't know if I would have been able to really figure out.
Yeah, so interesting, and, like, the fact that they had, like, a dedicated women's investment group for
Yes.
these wealthy daughters of American Revolution type, high society women. I thought that was really interesting
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. I mean, that was basically, and if you look at the early history, there were a lot of women through the 20s who had like big officer like jobs, but they were all really manning some aspect of the women's department. They were women serving women like them. And
Amazing. Yeah, so
yeah, I mean,
interesting. Yeah.
there was another side to that era, right? This was also the first time that everyone could get involved in the stock market, and it was a
Mhm.
bubble in that way. And so there were women who were like stock brokers, but they were like going to outer suburbs, and they were kind of in the diaspora making house calls and taking mail orders. So that wasn't what I wanted the action.
Yeah,
B wanted
yeah.
to be the action, like the real deal,
Right, right.
you know?
So, talking about B, I want to talk about characters. You have B, who, as we talked about, brilliant, trying to like break into a place that is a poor Jewish girl no one breaks into on Wall Street, and then her brother, who's kind of like her polar opposite in a lot of ways, like
Mhm.
kind of very handsome, and he's the like literally the fair haired boy. She's dark and small, and he's like tall and blonde. And so, why twins? And how did you come up with them? Like, how did you develop them? I thought that was so interesting.
So, you ask really good questions, by the
Oh,
way.
thanks. I try.
You really do. You're a good reader and a good question asker and a good writer.
Thank you.
Um, the twin idea, when I first came up with the twin idea, I wanted them to be identical twin. I see someone in the comments just asked if I'm a twin. Not only am I not a twin, I have a half sister from my father's second marriage who I never lived with. So I'm basically an only child. But I have a girl and a boy who are 2 years apart. And so the sibling relationship was foreign to me when I had children. So I think I'm extra fascinated by sibling relationships because I don't totally understand them from my own experience. Um, and originally they were twins because I was gonna have B kind of do like a reverse Tootsie and dress up as Jake and take on his identity. That was one of my original ideas. And so I was like, well, then they need to be twins. And then I started to think about all of the twins that I know and people I know who have twins. And there is this connection, this like almost psychic connection that twins seem to have.
Mhm.
And even if they are polar opposites, which sometimes they are when they're fraternal, but I loved the idea that they could be the yin and yang to one another and still help each other. And for I've had people ask me about feeling like the relationship is toxic, and I think I did not intend for it to be toxic. I intended for it to be real, and families are complicated, and so
Mhm.
I wanted Jake to have it easier than B, but it only in some ways, right? Because he gets pretty screwed because he just keeps being impulsive. His impulsivity really does him in. But I
Mhm.
wanted him to be the one who was the handsome, good, charming, because that would just give him one more thing that would help him fit in a world where still as a Jewish man, not necessarily easy, but the rules were totally different for men than women in
Mhm.
the 20s on Wall Street. I mean, they wanted bodies for men, and you didn't have to have a college degree. They were training you on the job, like all that stuff was real.
Mhm.
Um, so as I started to think about all the ways they could be yin and yang, I mean, it was probably a little trite to make her all dark and make him all blonde, but there's,
Worked.
within Judaism too, there's this idea of like passing a little bit as not Jewish. And I liked the idea that he would have this fluidity that she didn't have, and that she would have an identity that she couldn't escape in any way. And that instead she was going to have to own and embrace and overcome and make peace.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that, the passing aspect of the story, but yeah, that makes sense too.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
This is also a story with strong female friendships, and I loved the friendships, and I also loved because you got to get into kind of the nightlife and the clothing and the fun and the fashion of the 1920s. How did you come up with Henny and Mildred slash Millie? How did you come up with them?
I mean, I have to say they kind of just appeared. Like
Nice.
I decided B needed friends.
Mm-hmm.
And the lobotomist's wife was my first book was very insular in a lot of ways. It was really just this tight relationship and this tight little world of mental illness. And I wanted, the 1920s to me just has that. I mean, it has a lot of things. There's a lot of darkness, but it has that spirit that how can you write about the 20s and not a young person in the 20s and not have some fun?
Mm-hmm.
And, and then my mom is a therapist, and I think I grew up thinking very psychologically about people. So my characters as they emerge always have backstories and motivations and a whole life story. So Henny is, she there's things I wanted to represent that I learned about. Like there was a huge divide in the 20s between Jews who had been in America for now like two generations versus Jews who were the first generation born in America. And Henny was the prior, and as a result, she lived a much more upscale life than B did. But she was embracing the 20s and wants to be a modern woman, and so those things sort of came to be. I thought that was came to be, not BEA, but BE. I thought that was a good counterpoint to who B was, because there's like the very, very secular, modern Jewish girl, and then there's the like more traditional trying to find her way in the world. And then I loved the idea of Henny being this like archetype of who should be successful on Wall Street, but she was got in her own way because she was so awkward. Like it all just
Oh, you mean Mildred?
I mean Mildred.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
said Henny. Yeah, I mean Millie.
Millie.
And then she has Sophie, who's like,
Oh.
part of the melting pot of the Lower East Side diaspora, this like Italian girl who's making her way in a whole different avenue. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, they kind of all just evolved. Like they just popped
Yeah.
in, and then they kept going. And then I wanted to have the fun and games and the fashion and the speakeasies and the night. I wanted that for this book. So I found a way to make it
Yeah,
happen.
no, I love that. It balances it out. Exactly.
Yeah.
I have writing questions, as I always do. And just a reminder, after I ask my writing questions, you can put questions for Sam in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll take those as well. So I'm always interested in point of view choice. Did you always plan on writing this in first person point of view from B's perspective?
I tend to, I've been playing with other ideas and books. I seem to like close first person, but it's not I. It's like you have to see it through B's eyes, but you don't have to. There's a little bit of room,
Right.
um, and that seems to be where I feel comfortable. I actually started to play with writing a book in the true first person voice with I did and I saw. And
Hmm.
I got so stuck, like immediately, somehow saying, then she thought makes it so much easier for me than I thought. I don't know why.
Yeah, yeah.
But I like to be, again, I like intimacy. There's like an
Mhm.
intimacy that comes with that close first person voice or close second person. Is it it's first person, I guess.
First person close, right?
Yeah.
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 Yeah,
So,
I agree. I like it too. I think it puts the readers in the story, in
yes.
that way. Yeah, yeah. We talked a little bit about this. How do you strike a balance between fact and fiction in your storytelling, and do you have any hard and set rules?
So I, I think that my hard and set rule for this book was about the market. For some reason I got really stuck on that the investors couldn't have a good day if the market was actually down that day. And I got to the point where I had to stop looking at daily stuff and pull out and be less granular because it was impacting my story. Like at one point my editor said to me, like, you can give yourself a little freedom here. Like you don't have
Right,
to
right.
follow it day by day. So that was one of my big pieces of fact. I always like when historical fiction has some real people in it, and you do that too. Like I pull people from history and moments and incidents that were real in history, and I put them in the book. The one place that I did not do that, that I took artistic license, was actually with the opening, and this doesn't give much away because it's the first 3 pages, but there's people jumping out windows as the market is crashing. And the financial district was an absolute mess and a disaster zone, but it's that is likely just urban legend. It's popular urban legend, and I was like, this is
Yeah.
too dramatic not to put in the book. But
Hmm.
but I that one I sort of said I'm not going to care if it actually happened or not. It's just it's such a visual way to understand the level of panic and despair that was happening in that moment, that I used it as a device,
Yes.
whether
Yeah.
it was right or not. But so I guess I think I need to know if I'm not writing a fact correctly. Like I want the world, and I'm a stickler for I try not to be anachronistic in any way. So if someone's going to a restaurant from downtown to uptown, I want to know, I have subway maps of the time. I have, I know what the taxis looked like and what, which restaurants people would lunch at. And I try and really keep all of that very factual, and then the characters can do whatever they want in that world. It's like I build a Lego set with facts and then I set them out to play.
Excellent. I like that. Um, and so are you a plotter or a pantser? I feel like we've talked about this before and I can't remember your answer. What's your writing process like?
So I'm like, in general, I'm neurotic and organized. I feel like as I'm getting older, I'm a little bit less that way. So I would say I'm definitely a plotter. Like for this book and for The Lobotomist's Wife, I don't outline to the scene detail or to the chapter, every scene in a chapter kind of detail. I know the big beats of what's going to happen all the way through.
Hmm.
But then in each writing session, I let myself meander. And there were like a couple moments in this book that really just surprised me as I was writing. And I let that happen. And I love that. And actually, right now, I'm trying to write a contemporary thriller just for
Oh,
fun.
yeah.
I'm working on a historical fiction, but it's really intense, and I feel like I want to do something that's like lighter and fun. And so I'm trying to write. I live in Greenwich, Connecticut. I'm trying to write like a social satire suspense novel that takes place in Greenwich, Connecticut, and I know the basic plot, but I haven't put it down on paper. And so I am pantsing for the first time, and it's hard. I find
Good for
it
you.
harder, a
Yeah.
lot
A
harder.
lot harder.
Yeah.
You mentioned story beats. So do you pay a lot, like think a lot about story structure up front too, or you just kind of roughly?
I do. I don't do it to the point where I'm like actually mapping out an arc, but I think to me it's a little bit innate that like a story has to have a driving narrative. A story has to have you turning pages. A story has to have high stakes. A story has to have a protagonist who goes on some kind of journey. Like I think I've got the words to make sense of that when in books that are in craft books and things, but I know that innately. And
Mhm.
because I watch a lot of television and I read a lot of books, so you
Yep.
sort of like I know the point at the book where in the book where you say, where is this going? And if the author
Mhm.
doesn't tell you, you're going to put it down, right?
Yes.
Like it's the natural instinct as a writer is like, I'm going to hold back, I'm going to hold back, I'm going to dance around the subject as much as I can. So I'm kind of aware of those things as I'm writing,
Mhm.
but I don't do like a save the cat, like these are the beats and this is what happens where, and unless I need to. Like if I feel like the book is really dragging, then I will go back and kind of put it through that structure. But too much of a paradigm and I'm frozen and paralyzed. So it's like somewhere in between.
That
Again,
totally makes sense. And Save the Cat for people who don't know, it's a screenwriting structure, but now there's a novel writing structure book as well. Save the Cat writes a novel, and I have that one on my shelf as well. But
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, it's a great framework, but I find frameworks are, again, like they can be as oppressive as they can be helpful.
I
So
agree. Yeah, there's a balance there for
yeah.
sure. So we have aspiring authors in the audience, and you've now published 2 novels very successfully. What's the best advice you can give them about writing and getting published?
So it is true that you have to, and I think that most people say, like, you got to get your butt in the seat and just write. And there's no question that that's not true. But I've been thinking a lot lately, and I really think that one of the most important things, and I'm interested to see what you think of this answer, is to have a community of other people who are writing. Whether you do that, whether that is a workshop group, or whether it is, whether you find a way to network and it's in your community center, whether it's online, like, this is a really hard business.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so insular to sit and write, and you can get so discouraged. And so much of what we go through as aspiring writers and even published writers makes you question yourself, and you're analytical naturally. And so if you don't have that group, it makes it so much harder.
That
So
is excellent advice. Yes, I completely agree. And I'm trying to do more to reach out to like my author friends because they're the only ones that can understand like what you
yes,
go through and
yes,
with all of these, like we were just talking before we got on live. And yeah,
yes,
yeah, you get it. You know what I'm going through.
yeah,
I know what you're going through. And it's hard for
yes,
people who are outside of this world to understand. So yeah, I
yeah.
completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then as far as craft and getting published and all that, I do think the more you write, the more you read, and the more you write, the more you learn. And I have a quote that was up. I moved recently and my pin board's down and stuff, so I don't have it right now. And so I'm gonna butcher it. But it's a quote that from John Steinbeck that basically says, write freely and as quickly as possible and get it all down and go back later. And
Hmm.
that doesn't work for everyone. For some people that makes them panic, but for me, I find if I can let myself, if I can just say I'm going to put my computer on do not disturb for, I like timed writing. So from a very like structured craft perspective, if you are having a hard time writing and you say I'm going to sit down and I'm going to put focus on my computer for an hour or for 30 minutes and I'm just going to see what comes out, what I come up with, and it can be anything, that is a great way to encourage productivity, I think.
Yeah,
So
I do that. I do that too. Yeah, I have to shut everything off and just like set a word count in an hour or two, and just yeah,
yeah,
because
the world,
I
it's too distracting. Like,
yeah
it's
yeah
impossible.
it's impossible. Yeah, so I think that's really good advice too. Okay, I heard this question on another podcast on Ellen Hildebrand's and Tim Talks Books podcast, and I'm stealing it because I thought it was good. Was there a book that you read growing up that made you want to be a writer? That you were like, oh, I want to do this someday. I love this book so much. Was there any books like that?
So it's funny to ask me that. It's funny that you asked that because I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and in this way, I am not like most writers. I've always been an avid reader, but I recently had to, for some podcast or like on blog interview, I had to think back to all these, like the kinds of books I was reading in my childhood. And I was not the girl reading Jane Austen and the classics and feeling romantic and, Anne of Green Gables. Like, that wasn't me. I was reading these weird books called Dark Forces when everyone else was reading Sweet Valley High. And
Valley High.
they were these like kids would go in a cave and there'd be some kind of spirit. And I was really into Agatha Christie. And so I think always on some level, and I definitely read more intellectually by the time I was in college and in my 20s, and I really appreciated beautifully written books and beautifully crafted books. But and I think I still write this way. I'm more about the characters and the plot and getting and concise and clear storytelling than I am about the beauty of language.
Hmm.
And I never thought I was going to be a novelist. I always loved writing, but what I was always best at was argumentative essays. Like, I was a TA in college and I taught people how to write like a thesis statement and the backup of it, all of that. And then
Hmm.
I worked in business strategy and I wrote strategic presentations. Like, that's where my mind begins. So it doesnno start with literature for me, which is kind of, I feel like it's an embarrassing, like, I feel like I should go hide
No.
now. Someone's going to throw something at me.
No, I think it's so interesting, and I also think that you might need to write that thriller, given your, like, love of Agatha Christie and, like, that kind of stuff from a young.
Yes. Well, this was
Yeah.
like an epiphany I had. I was like, wait, I've always liked this. Like, I'm
Yeah.
totally a scaredy cat at the same time, but I have always liked the suspense mystery thriller. I was obsessed with Agatha Christie when I was young.
Yes,
Obsessed with
yeah, same.
everything. Yeah.
I think you need to get on that. So, um, talk a little bit about, On Being Jewish. Is it Being Jewish Now or On Being
It's
Jewish Now?
On Being Jewish Now, and
On
what you had was like an old press release, and I think they were still toying with the name at that point.
Oh, okay.
Um,
On Being Jewish Now, and
On
it
Being
that's
Jewish Now.
yeah, so that's coming out November 8th. Talk about your essay, talk about how that project, came to be.
I mean, it's a crazy story. So, On Being Jewish Now is an anthology of essays, 75 writers, celebrities, advocates. I'm like nobody in this scheme of this thing, and I it's true. It's
Stop
true.
it.
It's true. But over the summer, Zibby Owens, who I know you know Jane, and I don't know if your listeners probably know as well because she's got a big podcast that people listen to, if nothing else. Um, she reached out. She started with a group of other writers, Lisa Barr, Allison Hammer, Jackie Friedland, like a bunch of women started this Artists Against Anti-Semitism nonprofit after October 7th of last year. And basically, Zibby decided that wouldn't it be great if she could do a book, an anthology of people musing about their feelings about being Jewish now in the wake of October 7th, 2023. And she sent this email out to a ton of people, a ton of writers and others saying, can you write an essay about this? And can you do it in like 3 weeks? Because I want to have this book out. This was in July. I want to have the book out by, I wanted to do an audio launch by October 7th or right around October 7th. And then I want to have a physical book before the end of the year. And so we all did it. And I maybe I'm talking too long. So stop me, please. If I'm
No,
going.
you're good. You're good. No.
So for me, the essay I wrote is called Jewish, and somebody recently, when I was hosting I was like guest hosting a Facebook group, and I was talking about this a little bit, and someone said, "Oh, I'm a Christmas tree Jew too," and I was like, "Damn, I should have called the essay The Christmas Tree Jew." That's basically what I am. I grew up with like almost no real like Jewish family tradition, although I was bat mitzvahed. Both of my parents, for their own reasons, kind of were atheists or had very like distant relationships with their Judaism. I'm fully Jewish, but I didn't grow up religious, and I grew up with a Christmas tree at both my mom's house and my dad's. My dad married his second wife was a lapsed Catholic, so they definitely had a Christmas tree because that's the piece of Catholicism that even people who don't go to church like to have. And my mom was kind of like giving her parents the finger, who they were like very, very religious Jews. And the minute she rebelled, and that was part of her rebellion, was that she had a Christmas tree. So I've always loved Christmas and the holidays and all of that. And I never felt, I've always felt a kinship to Jews, but I never felt a connection to my Jewish identity as part of my core. And that really changed after October 7th because first of all, I felt, and that's what my essay is about how it changed. And so I don't know if I want to give it away, but what happened, originally I spent a lot of my life, when I brought up this idea of passing, I spent a lot of my adult life, my married life, kind of passing because my husband is a WASP and I live in Greenwich, Connecticut. And so I'm Sam Woodruff, Samantha Woodruff, and I was always Sam Green. And now I'm Samantha Woodruff. And in the beginning, after October 7th, I was like, that's kind of a good thing. It's going to keep my kids safe. It's going to, but I was still posting just enough, like just pro-Israel, not, and I don't want to get into the politics of it because it's so complicated a year and a half later.
Yeah.
But the Hamas attack was a terrorist attack, in my opinion. And I felt very comfortable that was not political to say this was a terrorist attack and we need to stop the terrorists. and I appeared on blacklists because of it. Like I don't,
Wow.
and when that happened, I was like, I can't hide, and so I'm going to go the other way. And it has really like I wear a little tiny Jewish star now. I've never worn a Jewish star my entire life, but it really changed my connection to my Judaism.
Yeah, yeah, as it would. I can't even
Yeah,
begin to imagine, Sam. So,
yeah.
thank you for sharing that, and that book comes out November 8th. Pre-orders are always important, and it's for a good cause too. But how
We make
so
no money.
what that's right. It's not for yeah, it's not for the authors, it's for the cause. To my last, like, joint question, how can readers best keep in touch with you, and do you Zoom, with book clubs? And then I'll take any questions from the audience. We've already kept you for a while, though, so,
Oh,
um
yes. I'm sorry. I told you that I could talk for the entire
no,
time.
this is great, though. I love it.
Terrible. Um, Denise, the book's called On Being Jewish Now. You can
Yes.
find it everywhere, I think, at this point.
Mhm.
So you can get in touch with me on my website, samanthawoodruff.com. Nice speak girl. You can email me there. You can also, I'm on Instagram at Sam G. Woodruff Author. I tend to be on Instagram much more than Facebook, but it's the same handle, Sam G. Woodruff Author.
Mhm.
Um, I'm on Threads, but barely. So those are my places, and I love book clubs, and I'm absolutely happy to Zoom with book clubs, or do them in person if you're local, near to Greenwich, Connecticut. But I'm an early bird, so if you want me to come to your book club and it's after 7 o'clock, I'm out.
I know, we're both in our sweatpants from, like, the here on
Yeah,
out, yeah.
yeah,
Same.
exactly, exactly, totally.
Um, so, okay, couple of questions from the audience that I saw. Do you think Audrey asked, "Do you think investing in the stock market is like gambling in Vegas?" Would you say that's a
Um, that is actually a really loaded question. So um, like this is a huge topic on Wall Street. So yes, I do think it's gambling to a degree, but I do believe watching somebody who invests for a living, my husband, and having gone to business school and studied this a little bit, that there are indicators that can help you better predict what might happen to a stock or in the market overall. But that said, there's a book called A Random Walk on Wall Street, and basically the concept of that is that a monkey throwing darts at a board, basically to pick stocks, will have almost the same results over time as somebody who does like thorough research stock
Jeez.
picking. My husband doesn't agree with this, but
I'm sure. Yeah.
I think it's hard to not think there's a big gambling element no matter what, because there's always outside forces that make things do what you don't expect them to do.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah. Um, Denise asks, "What are you reading right now?" Or do you have a book recommendation, one that we should all read?
um, okay, well, I assume you're all historical fiction lovers, right? So, my most recent historical fiction read was you know what? I don't know what I mean, I have to recommend Linda Loigman's Love Elixir of Augusta Stern because it is just a fabulous book and it's all over the place. I imagine many of you have read it already. I really liked Husbands and Lovers by Beatrice Williams.
Oh,
Her
yeah.
and what I liked about it is I also secretly like to read like character driven romance, and it felt like an Annabelle Monaghan kind of character driven romance with some
Agree.
history, and I loved that combination. Right now, I'm listening to, and I'm curious if you read this, Jane, the Paris novel by Ruth Rachel. Have you read that?
I have it on my Kindle. I have not read it yet, though.
It's really interesting. Like it's really beautifully, I'm at the point where I'm like, where is this story going to go? But
Yeah.
I'm really enjoying it. And I'm reading The Whispers by Ashley Audrain because now I'm doing research about structure of suspense.
Nice, nice.
Yes,
Um,
fantastic food. That's exactly right. She describes food in such a rich way
oh,
that
she does. I miss her on Twitter because she used to
yeah,
describe food so beautifully on
yeah. I
there.
mean, but
Yeah.
she creates this whole world in the same way. It's like you're just there.
Yeah.
It's really good. It's good.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna have to gonna find out I have to read that one. I'm reading The Long March Home by Tosca Lee because she's coming next week. It's World War II novel, and she wrote it actually with Marcus Brotherton. I'm also reading I missed this one, even though I love Ann Patchett, the patron saint of liars by Ann Patchett, which is so good because it's Ann Patchett. It's just beautiful. So every time I read her, I'm like, oh yeah. But I'm so psyched to have you on. I love this book. I hope it soars. It's the trade-off. Hold if you can hold it up
Oh
again because I
yeah,
read
yeah.
it
Here
on
we go.
Kindle.
Here it is again.
Yes,
Here it
yes.
is. Yay.
Thank you. This was a delight, and hopefully we'll see each other in person when I'm in New York. I'll text you after this. And
Please.
thank you everyone for coming tonight, and sign up for next week. We've got another one next week. All right.
Thank you,
Thank you
guys.
so
Thanks,
much.
everybody. Thank you,
Have a
James.
great. Thank you.
Love
Take
seeing
care.
you.
Bye bye.